They called him the Alpha King, a ruthless warlord who drowned rebel cities in blood. When he crashed through her cabin door in the dead of winter, he was bleeding out. Chloe was just a starving peasant who barely reached his chest. She should have run from the monster. Instead, she looked the most dangerous man in the realm in the eyes and offered him her only blanket. She didn't know that this single act of mercy would rewrite history, because the tyrant who answered to no one was about to fall to his knees for her. The northern wind carried the sharp scent of winter across the abandoned valley. Alex pressed a heavy hand against his bleeding ribs as his horse stumbled through the deep dross. His trusted guards had fallen in the sudden ambush on the ridge, leaving their king to face the storm alone. Every ragged breath burned in his chest, yet his fierce pride refused to let him succumb to the freezing numbness. He was known across the realm as a ruler of absolute power, a man who never showed weakness to friend or foe. Now, a trail of dark blood followed him through the silent streets of a forgotten town. A pale light flickered from the cracked window of a small cottage at the edge of the woods. He dismounted with effort, his boots sinking into the white ground as his horse found shelter under a nearby lean-to. Inside the shivering structure, Chloe pulled her thin shawl tighter around her narrow shoulders. The harsh winter had taken her family and her livestock, leaving her with nothing but a dying hearth and an empty cupboard. She gasped when a sudden weight slammed against her fragile door, rattling the iron hinges. Armed raiders often passed through these borderlands, bringing nothing but destruction to the poor peasants. She grabbed an iron poker from the hearth, her small hands shaking with terror. The door swung open with a loud groan, letting in a swirl of white flakes and icy air. A massive silhouette blocked the entrance, his broad shoulders filling the entire doorway. Alex stood there for a silent moment, his dark eyes scanning the room before his knees buckled. He crashed to the dirt floor, his steel armor echoing loudly in the small space. Chloe dropped her weapon, her fear instantly replaced by pure instinct as she saw the dark stain on his tunic. She rushed forward and knelt beside him, realizing he was a warrior of immense stature. Her head barely reached his chest even as he lay prone on the ground. "Can you hear me?" she asked softly, her voice a gentle contrast to the howling wind outside. Alex offered only a low groan, his consciousness slipping away into the dark abyss of exhaustion. With immense effort, Chloe hooked her arms under his shoulders and dragged him toward the warmth of the fire. The physical strain made her lungs burn, but she refused to leave a dying man to the frost. She managed to roll him onto her straw pallet, the only bed she possessed. His face was pale beneath the dirt and dried blood, yet his features remained sharp. Chloe unbuckled his iron breastplate, her delicate fingers working quickly despite the biting cold. She found a deep gash along his wubs, left by a jagged blade during the treacherous attack. She ran to her small cupboard and pulled out her last jar of clean water and a clean strip of linen. As she washed the wound, Alex stirred, his large hand suddenly snapping out to grip her wrist. His grip was like an iron vice, born from years of constant battle and survival. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice a low rumble that shook the small room. Chloe winced from the pressure but did not pull away or scream in fear. "I am Chloe, and you are safe in my home," she replied, looking directly into his fierce eyes. Alex stared at her, stunned by the absolute honesty in her clear gaze. No assassin would look at him with such pure compassion. He slowly released her, his hand falling back to his side as his strength deserted him once more. Chloe did not scold him, she simply returned to her task, applying an herbal paste to his torn flesh. She bound the linen tight around his chest, her touch remarkably soft for someone who lived such a hard life. Once the bleeding stopped, she noticed him shivering from the severe chill that clung to his skin. Without hesitation, Chloe took her wool blanket and draped it carefully over his broad shoulders. The icy air immediately pierced her thin dress, causing her own limbs to tremble. She ignored her discomfort and walked to the hearth, adding her last log to the flickering flames. She then fetched a wooden bowl containing her remaining portion of oats. It was her only meal for the next 2 days, yet she did not think twice about giving it away. She sat on the edge of the pallet and gently raised his head, holding the bowl to his chapped lips. "Drink this warm broth, sir," she murmured, encouraging him with a reassuring nod. Alex swallowed the simple food, feeling the warmth spread slowly through his frozen limbs. He looked at her small face, noting the dark circles under her eyes and the pale hue of her cheeks. He realized with a sudden pang that this girl was starving, yet she was feeding him instead of herself. In his royal court, men killed for a single gold coin, while this peasant offered her life for a stranger. "Why are you helping me?" he rasped, his throat dry from the winter air. Cleely offered a small smile, her fingers lightly brushing a stray lock of hair from his forehead. "Because you were dying at my door, and no one deserves to face the dark alone," she answered softly. Her simple words struck a chord deep within his hardened heart, shattering a piece of his lifelong cynicism. Alex watched her as she stood up to return to the cold floor, intending to leave him the comfort of the bed. He reached out and caught the hem of her sleeve, his gesture surprisingly gentle for a man of his might. "Stay," he ordered quietly, though the command held a rare note of vulnerability. He pulled back a section of the wool blanket, inviting her to share the meager warmth. Chloe hesitated for a second, then crept onto the edge of the pallet, her small body fitting perfectly beside his massive form. The contrast between them was striking. She seemed like a fragile sparrow resting beside a wounded lion. As the storm continued to rage outside, the small cottage became a sanctuary against the cruel world. Alex closed his eyes, the steady sound of her breathing providing a strange sense of peace he had never known. He knew his enemies were searching for his body, believing they had destroyed his kingdom. They did not know that the Alpha King had survived, and that his heart had found a new anchor. He swore a silent oath to the heavens as the embers cast long shadows across the room. Those who betrayed him would face total ruin, and this girl would never know hunger or cold again. The dawn eventually broke through the frosted windows, painting the room in gray light. Alex felt his incredible strength returning, the danger of the wound passing thanks to her timely care. He looked down at the sleeping girl who barely reached his chest, knowing his destiny was now bound to hers forever. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty floorboards of the cabin. Alex woke to the rhythmic sound of chopping wood outside the frost-covered window. He pushed aside the thin blanket and stood, his boots heavy against the dirt floor. His chest ached dully, but the herbal poultice had drawn the worst of the burning fever away. He walked to the glass and watched Chloe working diligently in the deep snow. She lifted an iron axe that seemed entirely too heavy for her thin arms. Every swing cost her immense effort, her breath turning to white mist in the freezing air. Alex felt a strange tightness in his throat as he observed her daily struggle. He had commanded armies of thousands and watched rival empires fall without a second thought. Yet the sight of this fragile woman fighting for basic survival stirred a deep, unfamiliar anger within him. He pushed the heavy wooden door open and stepped out into the biting winter wind. Chloe paused and dropped the axe, her eyes widening in genuine surprise. "You should be resting in bed," she scolded gently, wiping sweat from her pale brow. Alex did not answer immediately. He crossed the short distance between them and took the wooden handle from her frozen fingers. His hands easily enveloped hers, transferring a vital warmth to her shivering skin. "Go inside and sit by the fire," he instructed, his tone brooking no argument. Chloe opened her mouth to protest, but the quiet authority in his voice made her pause. She watched in silent awe as Alex swung the heavy axe with effortless precision. Thick logs split into perfect halves in a matter of mere seconds. He finished a week's worth of her chores before the sun had fully risen above the dark tree line. When he finally returned to her side, Chloe handed him a steaming cup of hot water. They sat in a comfortable silence, the crackling fire providing the only music in the bleak morning. Suddenly, the peaceful atmosphere shattered completely. The harsh sound of galloping horses echoed loudly through the quiet, isolated valley. Alex tensed, his keen instincts instantly recognizing the steady rhythm of armored cavalry. Chloe rushed to the window and gasped at the sight of black banners piercing the white fog. "Soldiers," she whispered, her voice trembling with absolute terror. "They are searching every house along the border," she added, stepping back quickly from the glass. Alex stood up smoothly, his face hardening into a mask of pure lethality. These were the exact men who had orchestrated the treacherous ambush in the canyon. They had come to finish the job, tracking his trail to this secluded refuge. Loud voices barked harsh commands outside, followed by the heavy thud of boots on the porch. "Hide in the cellar," Alex told her quietly. Chloe shook her head and grabbed his arm tightly. "They will kill you," she pleaded, her fingers digging desperately into his sleeve. Alex looked down at her, his dark eyes softening for a fleeting moment. "No one in this world can kill me, Chloe," he stated simply. Before she could process his words, the wooden door exploded inward. Splinters of wood flew across the room as 3 armored mercenaries stepped into the tiny cabin. They drew their steel swords, grinning cruelly as they spotted their injured target. "We found him," the leader sneered, raising his blade to strike. Alex moved faster than the human eye could track. He did not reach for a weapon, relying entirely on his overwhelming physical power. He stepped forward and seized the leader directly by the throat. The mercenary's armor crumpled under Alex's iron grip like dry parchment. With a single swift motion, Alex threw the heavy man backward through the broken doorway. The leader crashed into the snow and did not move again. The remaining 2 soldiers froze, their arrogant smiles vanishing instantly. Alex channeled his strength, the air around him growing heavy with an oppressive dark energy. He struck the second man in the chest, the sheer impact sending the soldier flying backward into the yard. The last mercenary dropped his weapon and fell to his knees in sheer terror. Alex stood over him, casting a long, terrifying shadow that completely swallowed the trembling man. "Tell your masters that the winter has not claimed me," Alex commanded coldly. "Tell them I am coming to reclaim my throne." The soldier scrambled to his feet and ran toward his horse, vanishing desperately into the snowy woods. Silence returned to the ruined cabin, save for the whistling wind pouring through the entrance. Alex turned slowly, fully expecting Chloe to cower in fear at the violence she had just witnessed. Instead, she stood firmly by the hearth, her dark eyes filled with shock but devoid of revulsion. She looked at the broken door and then at his hands. She walked forward, ignoring the freezing air rushing into her home. Chloe took his large hand in hers and gently examined the fresh scratches on his knuckles. "You tore your bandages," she noted quietly. Alex stared at her bowed head, a profound realization settling heavily in his chest. He was a monster to the rest of the world, a weapon forged in blood and eternal war. Yet to her, he was simply a man who needed taking care of. He gently withdrew his hand and cupped her small face. "Pack whatever you wish to keep," Alex said, his voice steady and resolute. "We are leaving this place today." Chloe looked up, her expression a complex mix of confusion and hesitant hope. She barely reached his chest, yet in that moment, she held the absolute center of his world. Chloe packed her few possessions into a worn canvas sack. She lingered by the cold hearth, tracing the rough stones with a trembling finger. This crumbling cabin held the last fading memories of her family. Alex stood silently by the doorway, watching her quiet grief. He understood the heavy anchor of the past. "We can build a new hearth," he said softly. Chloe nodded and wiped a single tear from her cheek. She stepped out into the blinding white expanse of the winter morning. Alex whistled sharply. His massive warhorse trotted out from behind the snow-covered lean-to. The beast snorted, tossing its dark mane as it approached its master. Alex took the canvas sack from Chloe and tied it securely to the saddle. He then turned to her, placing his hands lightly on her narrow waist. Before she could brace herself, he lifted her effortlessly into the high saddle. She gasped as the ground dropped away. Alex swung up behind her, his large frame shielding her completely from the biting wind. He wrapped his heavy wool cloak around them both, creating a cocoon of vital warmth. "Hold on to the mane," he instructed it. Chloe obeyed, her hands looking impossibly small against the thick black hair of the horse. Alex spurred the mount forward. They left the ruined cabin behind, riding deep into the ancient, silent forest. The journey was brutal and slow. Snow drifts swallowed the trail, forcing the horse to wade through waist-deep powder. The wind howled through the dark pines, threatening to tear them from the saddle. Alex kept one arm securely wrapped around her waist, anchoring her against his solid chest. She could feel the tight coils of his muscles shifting beneath his tunic with every movement of the horse. He moved with an innate grace, a predator entirely at home in the wild. Chloe peeked out from beneath the thick wool of his cloak. The snow fell heavily, erasing the path ahead and plunging the forest into a white abyss. "Are we lost?" she asked, having to raise her voice above the screaming wind. I know these woods better than I know the halls of my own palace, Alex replied. His voice vibrated against her back, a deep rumble that chased away her anxiety. They rode through a narrow gorge, where jagged ice hung from the high cliffs. Alex steered the horse skillfully, avoiding concealed crevices and treacherous rocks. He did not complain about his healing wound, though Chloe knew the motion must cause him pain. She leaned back against his chest, finding a strange comfort in the steady rhythm of his heart. She had spent her entire life fighting the cold alone. Now, this intimidating stranger formed an impenetrable wall against the harsh world. Hours passed as they navigated the treacherous mountain pass. The gray sky darkened into an oppressive twilight. A cluster of wooden buildings finally emerged from the evening fog. It was a rough border settlement, a place favored by smugglers and desperate travelers. The air smelled heavily of wood smoke and stale ale. Alex guided the horse toward the largest structure, a multi-story inn built from dark timber. He dismounted first, his boots hitting the muddy snow with a heavy thud. He reached up and pulled Chloe down, letting her slide safely against his side. Her legs wobbled slightly from the long ride. Alex kept a steadying hand on her shoulder as they approached the heavy oak door. He pushed it open, stepping into the noisy, crowded common room. The tavern fell silent as the patrons noticed the imposing newcomer. Alex ignored the hostile stares. He led Chloe directly to the wooden counter where a fat innkeeper stood wiping a dirty mug. The innkeeper eyed Alex's battered armor, then sneered at Chloe's threadbare dress. "We don't take beggars," the man barked, crossing his thick arms. "Take your little stray and find a barn." Chloe shrank back, instinctively trying to hide behind Alex's arm. Alex did not raise his voice. He simply reached into a concealed pouch at his belt. He pulled out a heavy, solid gold coin stamped with the royal crest. He slammed it onto the scarred wood of the counter. The impact sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. The innkeeper stared at the gold, his jaw going slack. The crest of the Alpha King was unmistakable, a symbol of absolute sovereignty. Whispers erupted among the rough men drinking at the tables behind them. A few hands drifted nervously toward hidden daggers. Alex turned his head slightly, sweeping his gaze across the crowded room. His dark eyes promised sudden, violent death to anyone who dared to move. The tavern immediately fell completely silent again. No one breathed loudly as Alex turned his attention back to the counter. "I want your largest room," Alex commanded, his voice cold and flat. "I want a hot bath drawn within the hour, and a meal brought up." The innkeeper scrabbled backward, nearly dropping his mug. "Yes, my lord," he stammered, his arrogance vanishing into pathetic subservience. "Right away, my lord." Alex pointed a finger at the man. "Send someone to the merchant next door," Alex added. "Purchase a thick fur coat, sturdy boots, and 3 warm dresses." He leaned closer, his dark hairs locking onto the trembling man. "If the quality is poor, I will hold you personally responsible." The innkeeper nodded frantically, snatching the gold coin with greedy, shaking fingers. He yelled for a servant girl to show them up the stairs. Chloe followed Alex in a daze. She had never seen a gold coin in her entire life. They reached a spacious room at the end of the hall. A large stone fireplace dominated the far wall, radiating a blessed heat. A wide bed covered in thick furs occupied the center of the floor. Alex closed the heavy door, shutting out the noise of the tavern below. He unbuckled his sword belt and set it carefully on a wooden table. Chloe stood frozen near the entrance, afraid to touch anything in the luxurious room. She looked at her muddy shoes and then at the clean woven rug. "I will dirty the floor," she whispered. Alex sighed, a sound that held no anger, only a profound weariness. He walked over and gently guided her toward the fire. "You will never apologize for existing in my presence, Chloe," he said firmly. "This room is yours." He pushed a padded chair toward the hearth and motioned for her to sit. Chloe sank into the soft cushions, the sheets seeping into her frozen bones. A knock sounded at the door a few minutes later. 2 servants entered, carrying steaming buckets of water and a large wooden tub. They worked quickly, their eyes darting nervously toward Alex, who stood watching in silence. Once the tub was filled, they brought in a tray laden with roasted meat, fresh bread, and hot stew. Another servant hurried in with a bundle of fine clothing. Alex dismissed them with a sharp wave of his hand. When the door clicked shut, he turned to Chloe. "Eat first," he instructed, pulling a chair to the small dining table. Chloe looked at the feast, her stomach twisting with painful hunger. She sat down and took a tentative bite of the warm bread. The rich flavor overwhelmed her senses, bringing sudden tears to her eyes. She had survived on stale crusts and watery oats for 2 long years. Alex sat across from her, watching her eat with quiet satisfaction. He did not touch the food until she had finished her first bowl of stew. "I owe you a life," he stated calmly, slicing a piece of meat. Chloe shook her head, wiping her mouth with a clean napkin. "You owe me nothing," she replied. "I only did what anyone should do." Alex offered a dark, humorless smile. "Most would have sold me to the highest bidder." He set his knife down and leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. "My enemies are powerful, Chloe. They control the capital and half the military forces. But they made a fatal mistake." He looked deeply into her eyes, his expression turning terrifyingly absolute. "They let me live." Chloe felt a shiver run down her spine, not from fear, but from the raw power in his voice. "Where are we going?" she asked softly. "To a stronghold in the eastern mountains," Alex answered. "A place where my loyal commanders wait for my return." He stood up and walked toward the window, looking out at the dark town. "Once I reclaim my throne, retribution will be swift." He turned back to face her, the firelight casting harsh shadows across his scarred face. "And you will never know the feeling of hunger again." Chloe looked down at her hands, overwhelmed by the sudden shift in her destiny. She had saved a bleeding man in the snow only to find herself tethered to a fallen king. "Take your bath," Alex told her gently, breaking the intense silence. "I will wait outside in the hall to ensure we are not disturbed." He picked up his heavy sword and walked toward the door. Chloe watched his broad back, a sense of immense gratitude washing over her. She heard the heavy thud of his boots pacing in the hallway outside. He was acting as her personal guard, a sovereign standing watch over a commoner. She removed her worn, patched dress, shivering slightly as the cool air touched her skin. She stepped carefully into the wooden tub, sighing as the hot water enveloped her aching muscles. The scent of lavender soap filled the air, a luxury she had only ever heard of in stories. She scrubbed the dirt and soot from her skin, watching the water turn murky. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to relax. She closed her eyes, resting her head against the wooden rim. Her mind drifted back to the man standing on the other side of the door. Alex was a force of nature, a violent storm wrapped in human flesh, yet his hands had been infinitely gentle when he lifted her onto his horse. He possessed the power to crush the world, but he used it to shield her from a simple draft. She finished her bath and stepped onto the soft rug. She dried herself and put on one of the new garments the servants had brought. It was a dress of dark blue wool, lined with soft rabbit fur at the collar and cuffs. It fit her small frame perfectly, wrapping her in a warm, elegant embrace. She brushed her damp hair, untangling the knots she had ignored for months. When she finally opened the heavy oak door, Alex turned to look at her. He froze, his dark eyes widening imperceptibly. The soot and grime were gone, revealing her pale, delicate features and bright, observant eyes. She looked incredibly fragile, yet possessed a quiet dignity that demanded respect. Alex stepped into the room, closing the door firmly behind him. He did not offer a compliment, but the intense focus of his gaze spoke louder than words. "Get some sleep," he told her, gesturing toward the wide bed. "What about you?" Chloe asked, noticing he remained fully dressed. "I will sit by the fire," he answered, taking a seat in the padded chair. "I need to plan our route for tomorrow." Chloe climbed into the bed, sinking into the impossible softness of the feather mattress. She watched him staring into the flames, his profile sharp and unyielding. He was a warrior preparing for a war that would shake the realm. But as her eyes grew heavy, she knew she had nothing to fear from his darkness, because that darkness had wrapped itself around her, creating the safest place she had ever known. The journey through the eastern mountains tested the limits of their endurance. Ice covered the narrow paths, forcing the warhorse to pick its steps carefully along the sheer cliffs. Alex kept his arm wrapped firmly around Chloe throughout the grueling ride. He shielded her face from the biting wind with the heavy collar of his cloak. She learned to anticipate his movements in the saddle, leaning with him as they navigated the treacherous terrain. They spoke very little during those long, proving hours. Yet a quiet understanding blossomed between them in the silent white landscape. Chloe no longer felt the biting fear of starvation that had haunted her entire life. She knew Alex would dismantle the mountains themselves before letting her go hungry again. On the fourth day, the blizzard finally broke. A massive stone fortress emerged from the mist, built directly into the side of a jagged peak. High walls of black granite loomed over a deep ravine. This was the hidden sanctuary of his most loyal forces. Heavily armed sentries stood watch on the battlements, their armor glinting in the pale sunlight. One of the guards spotted the lone rider approaching the iron gates. A loud horn echoed through the frozen valley, signaling the arrival of an unknown presence. Dozens of soldiers rushed to the walls, aiming loaded crossbows at the narrow bridge. Alex stopped his horse at the edge of the chasm and pushed back his dark hood. He did not shout or demand entry. He simply let the cold wind carry the side of his face to the men above. A sudden, profound silence fell over the massive fortress. Then, a heavy shout rang out from the main tower. "Open the gates!" The massive iron chains groaned as the drawbridge lowered heavily over the ravine. Alex spurred his horse forward, his posture rigid and commanding. Hundreds of hardened soldiers lined the stone courtyard. These were veterans of brutal wars, men who had killed and bled for their king. As Alex rode through the stone archway, every single man dropped to one knee. The synchronized clash of armor echoed like thunder in the enclosed space. Chloe shrank back against Alex's chest, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the military display. She had never seen so many weapons, nor such terrifying men. A tall man with a scarred face stepped forward from the kneeling crowd. His name was Marcus, the top commander of the Eastern Army. "We thought you were dead," Marcus said, his voice thick with rare emotion. Alex pulled the reins, bringing his horse to a smooth halt in the center of the yard. "It takes more than a few traitors to bury me," Alex replied coldly. He swung his leg over the saddle and dropped heavily to the ground. The soldiers expected their king to immediately demand a war council. Instead, Alex turned back to the horse and reached up. He placed his hands on Chloe's waist and lifted her down with absolute care. He set her gently on the stone pavement, ensuring she had her balance before letting go. The entire courtyard stared in stunned silence. Their ruthless sovereign, a man who executed enemies without blinking, was treating this tiny girl like fragile glass. Chloe pulled her fur-lined cloak tighter, intimidated by the hundreds of eyes fixed upon her. Alex noticed her discomfort instantly. He stepped slightly in front of her, blocking her from the intense scrutiny of his men. His dark gaze swept across the kneeling soldiers, issuing a silent but deadly warning. Every man immediately lowered his head further, fixing his eyes firmly on the cold stones. Alex placed a protective hand on the middle of Chloe's back. He guided her through the heavy oak doors of the main keep. The interior was sparse and functional, designed strictly for war rather than comfort. He led her into a large circular room dominated by a massive wooden map table. 4 high-ranking generals followed them closely, their faces tight with suppressed questions. Alex pointed to a heavy iron chair at the head of the table. It was the high seat, traditionally reserved only for the ruling monarch. "Sit there," Alex told Chloe quietly. She hesitated, looking nervously at the stern generals standing by the door. "That is your chair," she whispered back. "It is just a piece of wood," Alex dismissed, guiding her gently into the seat. He took his own cloak and draped it over her shoulders to provide extra warmth. The generals exchanged shocked glances, but dared not speak a single word of protest. Alex turned away from her and braced his hands on the map table. His demeanor shifted instantly from gentle protector to predatory warlord. "Give me the casualty reports from the ambush," Alex ordered, his voice snapping like a whip. Marcus stepped forward and unrolled a large parchment across the carved wooden terrain. "We lost 50 men in the canyon, and the capital has been seized by the rebel council," Marcus reported grimly. Alex studied the map, his mind calculating distances and supply lines with cold precision. The generals began debating troop movements, their voices growing loud and aggressive. They discussed siege tactics and supply raids, completely ignoring the small girl sitting quietly at the head of the table. Chloe watched the violent planning, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The brutal reality of Alex's world pressed down heavily on her shoulders. She suddenly shivered, a small, involuntary movement caused by the drafty stone walls. It was a tiny sound, barely a rustle of fabric in the noisy room, yet Alex stopped speaking in the middle of a sentence. He raised a single hand, instantly silencing a general who was mid-shout. The room fell dead silent. The military men looked around in confusion, searching for the source of the sudden interruption. Alex ignored them completely and walked over to the large fireplace. He grabbed an iron poker and forcefully stirred the dying embers, piling fresh logs onto the grate. He waited until the flames roared to life before turning back to the table. He then walked over to a side table and poured a cup of hot spiced wine. He carried it over to Chloe and placed it directly into her cold hands. "Drink," he instructed softly. Chloe took a small sip, the warm liquid chasing away the chill in her bones. "Thank you," she murmured, offering him a hesitant smile. Alex nodded once, his hard features relaxing for a brief second. He then turned back to the frozen generals, his eyes turning cold and unforgiving once more. "Continue the report," Alex commanded, as if nothing had happened. The generals swallowed hard, finally understanding the absolute truth of the situation. The king had returned from the dead, bringing an incoming storm of blood and fire to their enemies. But the eye of that violent storm, the only safe harbor in his chaotic world, was the quiet girl sitting in his throne. The war council lasted late into the frozen night. Maps covered every surface of the command room, detailing the upcoming military campaign. Alex stood by the heavy oak table, dictating orders with relentless precision. He ignored the dull ache radiating from his healing ribs. His generals finally departed and the midnight bell tolled across the silent courtyard. Silence settled heavily over the stone fortress. Alex walked down the long corridor toward his private quarters. He pushed open the heavy wooden door and paused on the threshold. Chloe sat near the roaring hearth, mending a tear in his spare tunic. She looked up at the sound of his heavy boots. "You are awake late," Alex observed softly. He crossed the room and removed his heavy sword belt. "I was waiting for you," Chloe replied, setting the needle aside. She noticed the slight stiffness in his broad shoulders. Without another word, she walked over to the wash basin and poured fresh water. She retrieved clean linen and the herbal paste from her small satchel. The bitter scent of medicinal roots filled the quiet room. Alex watched her preparations with a quiet intensity. He sat on the edge of the large bed and unlaced his dark shirt. He let the fabric fall, revealing a torso mapped with old scars and fresh bruises. Every mark told a story of a brutal battle won at great cost. The wound from the ambush looked angry and red in the dim light. Chloe did not flinch or look away from his ruined skin. She had seen the harsh toll of survival, though never on this massive scale. She soaked Veth in the warm water and gently cleaned the dried blood. Her touch was incredibly light, offering comfort rather than pain. "You push yourself too hard," she murmured. Alex looked down at her bowed head, studying the curve of her pale cheek. "A king cannot show weakness before a battle," he answered. "You are not before a battle right now," Chloe pointed out gently. She spread the soothing paste over the jagged cut. Her small hands moved with practiced efficiency across his chest. Alex felt the constant tension slowly draining from his tired muscles. He realized he had never allowed anyone this close to his physical vulnerabilities. His trusted physicians only touched him under heavy guard. Yet he trusted this fragile woman with his very life. "The army marches in 3 days," Alex stated, breaking the quiet atmosphere. "We will take back the capital before the heavy snows block the main pass." Chloe wrapped a fresh bandage around his torso and secured the knot. She rested her hands lightly on his shoulders for a brief moment. "Will it be dangerous?" she asked. Alex reached up and covered her hand with his own. "War always carries risk," he admitted truthfully. He pulled her slightly closer, forcing her to look directly into his dark eyes. "But I will return to you, Chloe." He spoke the words like a sacred vow, leaving no room for doubt. The next morning brought a sudden disruption to the strict fortress routine.
Marcus dragged a bleeding soldier into the main courtyard. The generals gathered quickly, their faces grim and unforgiving. Alex stood on the stone balcony, looking down at the captured man. "He tried to slip out through the postern gate," Marcus reported loudly. "He carried a hidden letter addressed to the rebel council."
Alex descended the stone stairs, his presence silencing the angry murmurs of the troops. He approached the traitor, his face devoid of any emotion. Treason demanded a slow, agonizing public execution to serve as a warning. Alex drew his heavy iron dagger from his belt. The cold metal caught the pale morning light. He prepared to deliver a brutal punishment that would echo across the realm. He wanted every spy to know the terrible cost of betrayal. Just then, he heard a soft footstep on the upper walkway. Alex glanced up and saw Chloe standing near the stone archway. She had followed the noise from their quarters, wrapped tightly in her blue cloak. Her dark eyes observed the tense scene in the courtyard below. Alex froze, his grip tightening on the hilt of his weapon. He refused to let her witness the monster his enemies created. He sheathed the dagger with a sharp click. Alex signaled to Marcus with a slight nod of his head. "Hang him from the outer wall," Alex ordered simply. "Make it click." Marcus looked surprised by the sudden mercy, but nodded in immediate compliance. He gestured for 2 guards to secure the condemned prisoner. The guards dragged the sobbing traitor away from the main yard. Alex turned his back on the scene and walked up the stairs toward Chloe. His boots echoed loudly on the stone steps. He reached her side and placed a warm hand on her narrow shoulder. "You should not be out in the cold," he scolded mildly. Chloe looked up at his stern face, understanding exactly what he had just done. He had spared a man a torturous end simply because she was watching. "I wanted to see the morning sun," she lied softly. Alex guided her back inside the keep, shielding her from the harsh reality of his command. They walked down the silent corridor side by side. "You are a good man, Alex," Chloe said suddenly. Her words stopped him dead in his tracks. He stared at her, a profound shock registering in his dark eyes. No one had ever accused him of goodness. "I am a killer, Chloe," he corrected her, his voice rough with hidden pain. "I have drowned entire cities in blood." Chloe reached out and rested her small hand against his chest, right over his beating heart. "I know what you are," she answered without hesitation. "But you gave me your last blanket when you were bleeding to death." She stepped closer, her fragile frame seeking the warmth of his imposing figure. A monster does not know how to be gentle. Alex felt a sudden tightness in his throat. He slowly raised his arms and wrapped them around her shoulders. He pulled her against his chest, burying his face in her dark hair. Chloe hugged him back, her arms barely reaching around his waist. She offered him a silent, unconditional acceptance that cracked the foundation of his cruel world. For the first time in his violent life, he felt truly at peace. He knew the upcoming war would be the bloodiest conflict of his reign, but he also knew he finally had something worth surviving for. The Eastern Army marched when the first light of dawn broke over the jagged peaks. Thousands of hardened soldiers moved in perfect unison down the treacherous mountain pass. War banners of black and silver snapped violently against the freezing winter gale. At the center of this terrifying military formation rolled a single, heavy wooden carriage. Alex had ordered his finest craftsmen to build it specifically for the grueling journey ahead. Thick iron plates reinforced the oak walls, rendering the transport entirely impervious to arrows. Inside the fortified cabin, Chloe sat wrapped in layers of luxurious bear fur. A small charcoal brazier burned steadily in the corner, holding back the bitter frost. She peeked through the narrow viewing slit, watching the endless lines of marching infantry. Alex rode his massive warhorse right beside her window, never straying more than a few feet away. He wore his heavy battle armor, his dark cloak billowing like a storm cloud behind him. The bitter cold seemed to have absolutely no effect on his towering frame. He commanded the vast legion with sharp, efficient hand signals, completely focused on the road ahead. Yet every time the carriage hit a harsh rut, his dark eyes snapped immediately to the small window. He silently ensured she was secure before returning his attention to the vanguard. The march continued relentlessly for 5 days through the unforgiving wilderness. They entered a deep, winding canyon known for its treacherous shadows and narrow passages. Marcus halted the column, his seasoned eyes scanning the high cliffs with deep suspicion. The fading sunlight cast long, malevolent shadows across the rocky terrain. Without warning, a hail of burning arrows rained down from the ridge above. Rebel forces had laid a desperate ambush in a foolish attempt to break the king's momentum. The eastern soldiers immediately raised their heavy shields, forming an impenetrable roof of steel. Several arrows struck the reinforced walls of the carriage, bouncing off the iron plates harmlessly. Inside the dark cabin, Chloe covered her ears against the sudden, deafening clatter. She felt a sudden jolt as Alex dismounted his horse in a single, fluid motion. He did not draw his sword or call for defensive formations. He walked directly toward the canyon wall, his dark eyes fixed on the attackers above. A terrifying, oppressive energy began to radiate from his broad shoulders. He slammed his heavy gauntlet into the base of the towering cliff. The sheer force of the impact sent a massive shockwave traveling upward through the solid rock. Deep fissures ripped across the stone face, creating a deafening crack that echoed for miles. The rebel archers lost their footing as the entire ridge began to violently crumble beneath them. Huge boulders cascaded down the canyon walls, crushing the enemy positions into dust. The ambush was entirely annihilated in a matter of seconds, undone by absolute physical supremacy. Not a single drop of blood stained the valley floor. The opposition simply vanished beneath the heavy earth. Silence rapidly returned to the dark canyon, interrupted only by the settling debris. The hardened soldiers stared at the sheer devastation, their respect for their sovereign deepening into profound awe. Alex ignored the destruction he had just unleashed upon the traitors. He turned around and strode swiftly back toward the iron carriage. He pulled open the heavy door, his chest heaving slightly from the sudden exertion. His hard face was tight with a lingering, violent tension as he searched the dim interior. Chloe sat perfectly still on the velvet cushions, her hands resting calmly in her lap. She did not look terrified of the destructive power he had just displayed. She simply looked relieved to see him standing there without a scratch. "Are you hurt?" Alex demanded, his deep voice carrying a rare tremor of anxiety. Chloe shook her head and leaned forward, holding out a warm, damp cloth. She had heated water on the brazier the moment the shouting started. "I am safe," she answered softly. She reached up and gently wiped a smudge of stone dust from his hardened jaw. Alex closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, leaning slightly into her delicate touch. The furious storm raging inside his soul instantly settled into absolute calm. He realized in that moment that he no longer fought merely to reclaim a stolen throne. He fought to secure a world where she would never have to hear the sound of war again. He stepped back and closed the carriage door, ensuring the iron latch was secure. Alex mounted his horse once more, his posture radiating an undeniable authority. He raised his hand, signaling the massive army to resume their relentless advance. The soldiers marched forward with renewed zeal, their spirits bolstered by the invincible force leading them. They all understood a fundamental truth. As they passed the fortified carriage, the king ruled the vast northern empire, but the quiet girl in the carriage grounded the king. When twilight finally swallowed the canyon, the army established a fortified camp on the open plains. Hundreds of watchfires flickered against the dark horizon, creating a sea of stars on the ground. Alex personally escorted Chloe from the carriage to his command tent at the center of the encampment. The canvas structure was massive, lined with thick carpets and warmed by a large iron stove. He removed his heavy armor, the metal plates clanking loudly as he set them aside. Chloe watched him silently, noting the weary slump of his broad shoulders. She poured a cup of warm water and handed it to him, her fingers brushing lightly against his calloused skin. "The capital is only 3 days away," Alex stated, drinking the water in a single swallow. "Will they surrender?" she asked, taking the empty wooden cup from his hand. Alex offered a grim, humorless smile. "Traitors rarely surrender when they know no mercy awaits them," he replied honestly. He sat heavily on the edge of the cot, rubbing his temples to ward off a looming headache. Chloe moved behind him, her hands coming to rest gently on his tense shoulders. She began to massage the tight muscles, pressing her small thumbs into the hardened knots. Her strength was minimal compared to his, but her touch worked like a potent remedy. Alex let out a long breath, closing his eyes as the tension slowly melted away. He reached up and covered one of her hands, holding it securely against his collarbone. "You are the only peace I have ever known in this life," he murmured into the quiet tent. Chloe leaned down, resting her cheek against the crown of his dark hair. "I will stay right here until the war is won," she promised softly. They sat in comfortable silence, as the distant sounds of the military camp faded into the night. Alex knew the upcoming siege would require every ounce of his ruthlessness, but as long as she was waiting for him in the center of the camp, he knew he could never truly lose his humanity. The Eastern Army arrived at the gates of the capital under a bleak, gray sky. The massive stone walls of the city loomed over the frozen plains. Rebel banners hung limply from the high watchtowers, a pathetic display of false authority. Alex rode at the front of his vanguard, his dark armor absorbing the faint daylight. He halted his warhorse just out of range of the defensive ballistas. The heavy iron carriage carrying Chloe remained safely surrounded by his elite guard near the rear. A nervous silence gripped the battlefield as thousands of men waited for his command. The rebel council stood atop the main gatehouse, looking down in sheer terror. They had believed the king was dead, a rotting corpse left in the northern snow. Now, the consequences of their betrayal stood alive and breathing at their doorstep. The lead counselor leaned over the stone parapet with a trembling voice. He shouted empty promises of a truce, begging for negotiations to avoid a siege. Alex did not waste a single breath on a response. His keen eyes caught the faint metallic gleam of hidden crossbows shifting in the shadows above. The rebels were stalling to align a desperate synchronized volley. Alex dismounted gracefully and walked slowly toward the towering steel gates. The heavy doors had stood unbroken for 3 centuries, designed to withstand battering rams and catapults. He raised his right hand, summoning the dark, latent energy that ran deep in his blood. The air around him warped and grew heavy, suffused with an unnatural pressure. A dozen hidden crossbows fired simultaneously from the high walls. The heavy bolts shattered into harmless splinters against an invisible barrier before they could even touch his cloak. Alex drove his fist forward with devastating momentum. The impact released a tremendous shockwave that tore through the frozen ground. The ancient steel gates exploded inward, groaning in absolute defeat as the heavy iron hinges snapped. Massive pieces of twisted metal crashed violently into the courtyard beyond. The physical manifestation of his sheer power shattered the remaining morale of the rebel forces. Weapons clattered loudly against the stone as the defending soldiers dropped to their knees in mass surrender. The war for the capital was won in a single, breathless moment, without drawing a single blade. Alex signaled for Marcus to secure the city walls and apprehend the traitors. He turned and walked back to the iron carriage, his expression softening instantly as he approached. He opened the heavy door and extended his hand to Chloe. She took his warm hand and stepped down into the cold air of the conquered city. "The capital is ours," Alex told her quietly, his voice a low rumble. He led her through the ruined gates, his tall frame shielding her from the chaotic sights of the surrender. They walked together up the long, sweeping avenue toward the royal palace. Frightened citizens peeked through their wooden shutters, catching their first glimpse of the returning king. They expected to see a monster dripping with the blood of their defenders. Instead, they saw their terrifying sovereign adjusting his cloak to shield a small girl from the wind. The sprawling royal estate finally came into view at the top of the hill. It was a masterpiece of white marble and gold, a stark contrast to her humble origins in the woods. Chloe stared in quiet wonder at the towering pillars and expansive glass windows. She had spent her entire life scavenging for scraps in the freezing mud. Now, she was walking straight through the undisputed heart of the Northern Empire. They entered the grand throne room, where the vaulted ceiling stretched impossibly high. Hundreds of trembling nobles and captured rebel leaders knelt on the polished marble floor. They kept their heads bowed in absolute submission, waiting for the executioner's block. Alex did not even glance at the men who had plotted his demise. He guided Chloe steadily up the wide marble steps toward the towering throne. The seat of power was carved from solid obsidian, lined with deep crimson velvet. It was a cold, imposing chair meant for a ruthless and solitary sovereign. Chloe stopped at the base of the dais, feeling entirely out of place despite her fine clothes. Alex gently placed his large hands on her waist and lifted her effortlessly from the floor. He set her down directly onto the massive obsidian throne. She looked incredibly small against the high, dark backrest, yet she radiated a quiet, unyielding grace. A collective gasp echoed through the cavernous hall from the kneeling nobles. Only a crowned monarch was ever permitted to sit upon the ancestral throne. Alex stood beside her, resting one heavy hand protectively on the carved armrest. He finally turned his gaze upon the captive traitors, his dark eyes promising total ruin. "This empire no longer belongs to the corrupt," Alex declared, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "It belongs to the one who saved your king." He looked down at Chloe, his eyes entirely devoid of the wrath he showed the rest of the world. Chloe looked back at him, seeing the absolute sincerity etched into his hard face. She reached out and took his large hand, lacing her delicate fingers through his. The quiet, intimate gesture instantly silenced the entire room. The highest nobles realized their survival depended entirely on the mercy of a peasant girl. Alex squeezed her hand gently, anchoring himself in her calming presence. He had spent his life conquering territories and destroying rival armies across the continent. But as he stood beside her in the silent hall, he knew his greatest victory was simply bringing her home. The cold palace suddenly felt like a place where a real fire could finally burn. The transition of power brought a sudden quiet order to the war-torn capital. Alex purged the remaining traitorous elements with his usual brutal efficiency. However, he strictly shielded Chloe from the violent realities of his justice. He ensured that no screams or sounds of conflict ever reached the quiet wing of the royal palace. Chloe spent her first few days adapting to the overwhelming scale of her new home. Servants trailed after her constantly, eager to fulfill even her most silent requests. Yet she found no comfort in the endless silk gowns or the mountains of heavy gold jewelry. Whenever she looked out the high-glass windows, she saw the winter snow still burying the lower city. She remembered exactly how the biting wind felt through a thin, patched dress. One morning, she left her warm chambers and walked directly to the royal kitchens. The head chef dropped a massive silver tray in shock as the fragile girl entered his busy domain. Chloe ignored the sudden chaos and quietly requested the keys to the main food reserves. By midday, long lines of hungry citizens had gathered at the southern gates of the palace. Chloe stood in the freezing courtyard handing out hot bread and thick wool blankets. The royal guards stood nearby in absolute confusion, unsure if they should stop her. Alex watched the scene from a high balcony, his dark eyes fixed on her tireless movements. Marcus stood beside him, waiting for an order to disperse the desperate crowd. "Should we send her back inside, my king?" Marcus asked hesitantly. Alex shook his head, a rare expression of profound pride crossing his scarred face. "Let her do exactly as she pleases," Alex commanded softly. He walked down the marble stairs and crossed the snowy courtyard to stand by her side. The commoners fell to their knees in absolute terror as the Alpha King approached. Alex ignored them and took a heavy basket of bread from Chloe's freezing hands. He began distributing the food himself, standing shoulder to shoulder with his tiny companion. The sight of their terrifying sovereign serving the poor shocked the citizens into absolute silence. It was a brilliant political move, though Alex only did it to save Chloe from lifting the heavy baskets. Word of her kindness spread through the capital faster than any military decree. The people quickly began to refer to her as the true heart of the frozen north. However, the surviving high nobles were deeply insulted by her unconventional behavior. They despised the idea of a commoner holding such absolute sway over their ruthless king. 3 days later, a delegation of powerful lords requested a formal audience in the throne room. Alex sat upon the obsidian chair, his face a mask of cold, predatory boredom. Chloe sat on a slightly smaller chair placed directly beside his, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Lord Vance, the oldest and most arrogant of the nobles, stepped forward and bowed deeply. He brought forward 3 incredibly beautiful women, dressed in elaborate, jeweled gowns. "My king, we celebrate your glorious return to the throne," Vance began smoothly. "But a kingdom requires a strong lineage, and a king requires a queen of pure, noble blood." He gestured proudly to the 3 women standing behind him. "We present our daughters to you, hoping you might choose a suitable bride to secure your reign." The throne room fell so quiet that the crackling of the hearth sounded like distant thunder. Chloe felt a sudden cold weight settle deep in her stomach. She looked down at her plain hands, suddenly acutely aware of her own lack of status. She was just a girl from a ruined cabin, entirely unequipped for the cruel games of the royal court. Alex did not move a single muscle, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. He slowly leaned forward, resting his heavy forearms on his knees. His dark, unyielding gaze locked onto Lord Vance, stripping away the old man's confidence instantly. "You dare to lecture me on what this kingdom requires?" Alex asked, his voice dangerously soft. Lord Vance swallowed hard, suddenly realizing he had miscalculated terribly. "I only seek to honor the royal line, my king," the old noble stammered nervously. Alex stood up, his massive frame casting a long, terrifying shadow over the delegation. He walked down the steps of the dais, stopping inches away from the trembling lord. "Your daughters are useless to me," Alex stated flatly, dismissing the beautiful women without a glance. He turned his back on the nobles and walked back up the marble steps. He stopped in front of Chloe and extended his large hand toward her. She looked up, her dark eyes wide with a mix of surprise and silent questions. She placed her hand in his, letting him gently pull her to her feet. Alex turned to face the stunned court, keeping her firmly at his side. "This woman saved my life when men of your so-called noble blood betrayed me," Alex declared loudly. His voice echoed off the high vaulted ceiling, leaving absolutely no room for debate. "She is not a guest in this palace, and she is not a temporary distraction." He tightened his grip slightly, anchoring her against his solid side. "She is my equal, my chosen mate, and the only queen this empire will ever recognize." The 3 young noblewomen burst into quiet tears of humiliation and fear. "As for you, Lord Vance," Alex continued, his tone turning utterly ruthless, "your arrogance offends her, which means it demands an immediate punishment." He did not draw his blade, honoring his silent promise to Chloe to limit the bloodshed. "You are stripped of your lands, your titles, and your wealth. You will leave this capital by sunset, or you will not leave it at all." Lord Vance collapsed to his knees, his entire world destroyed by a single, foolish misjudgment. The guards quickly dragged the sobbing nobleman and his crying daughters from the silent hall. The remaining lords bowed so deeply, their foreheads pressed against the cold marble floor. They finally understood that insulting the king meant sudden death, but insulting the girl meant utter ruin. Alex dismissed the court with a sharp wave of his hand, demanding the room be cleared immediately. When the heavy doors finally clicked shut, they were entirely alone in the massive hall. Chloe looked up at Alex, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. "You gave up the support of the noble houses for me," she whispered in disbelief. Alex reached down and cupped her face, his thumb gently tracing her cheekbone. "I do not need their support to rule this world," he answered honestly. "I only need you." He leaned down and rested his forehead against hers, a gesture of profound, unspoken surrender. She barely reached his chest, yet she was the only force capable of bringing the Alpha King to his knees. He had conquered an entire continent, but she had conquered him completely. The bitter winter eventually surrendered to the gentle warmth of the approaching spring. Green shoots broke through the thawing earth across the sprawling royal estates. The citizens of the capital worked tirelessly to decorate the wide avenues with fresh flowers. Today was the official coronation of their new queen. Inside the royal chambers, Chloe stood quietly before a towering gilded mirror. 4 maids carefully adjusted the long train of her silver and blue silk gown. The fabric felt incredibly light, a stark contrast to the heavy wool she had worn for survival. She traced the delicate embroidery on her sleeves, her mind drifting back to the ruined cabin in the woods. She had once believed her entire life would be defined by hunger and isolation. Now, she was preparing to stand beside the most powerful man in the world. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts, and the heavy oak door opened. Alex stepped into the room, instantly commanding the attention of everyone present. He wore his formal royal attire, a dark velvet tunic lined with silver threads. He dismissed the maids with a silent nod, waiting until the heavy door clicked shut. He crossed the room and stopped behind her, their reflections merging in the tall glass. He was a towering figure of dark authority, while she looked like a fragile spirit of the dawn. "You look beautiful," Alex said, his voice a low, comforting rumble in the quiet room. Chloe leaned back slightly, resting her shoulders against his solid chest. "I am still terrified," she admitted honestly, watching his dark eyes in the mirror. Alex wrapped his arms around her waist, anchoring her to the present moment. "There is nothing left in this world for you to fear," he promised. He turned her around gently and held out his arm. Chloe rested her small hand on his forearm, drawing strength from his steady presence. They walked together down the long corridors, moving toward the grand cathedral in the city square. Thousands of citizens crowded the streets, their excited cheers echoing off the stone buildings. The massive iron doors of the cathedral stood wide open, revealing a sea of loyal soldiers and subdued nobles. Sunlight poured through the storied glass windows, painting the marble floors in vibrant colors. Alex led her slowly down the long center aisle. Every person in the massive hall bowed their heads in absolute respect as they passed. Marcus and the top generals stood near the altar, their swords lowered in a solemn salute. They reached the raised dais, where the high priest waited with trembling hands. Alex did not let the priest conduct the ceremony. He stepped forward and picked up a velvet cushion resting on a silver pedestal. Resting on the velvet was a crown entirely unlike the sharp, jagged metal worn by past queens. Alex had ordered his smiths to forge it from soft white gold and deep blue sapphires. It contained no sharp edges, designed only to reflect light and warmth. Alex turned to face Chloe, holding the delicate crown in his scarred hands. The entire cathedral fell completely silent, anticipating the historic moment. Chloe looked up at him, her heart swelling with an emotion far deeper than simple love. He was a man who conquered nations with an iron fist, yet he held her crown as if it were spun from glass. Alex stepped closer and carefully placed the sapphire crown upon her dark hair. He ensured it rested comfortably before he let his hands fall away. Then, the Alpha King did something that sent a collective shockwave through the empire. He took a deliberate step backward and slowly dropped to one knee. The man who bowed to no god and no army lowered his head before the small girl from the forest. "I pledge my sword, my throne, and my life to you," Alex vowed, his deep voice carrying to the very back of the hall. "You are my sole sovereign, today and until the end of my days." Tears blurred Chloe's vision as she looked down at the kneeling king. She reached out and placed her small hands on his broad shoulders. "Rise, my king," she commanded softly, her voice trembling with profound joy. Alex stood up, his dark eyes shining with an absolute, unwavering devotion. He leaned down and kissed her, sealing their destiny before the watching world. A deafening roar of applause erupted from the crowd, shaking the ancient foundations of the cathedral. The celebration lasted long into the night, filling the capital with music and light. However, Alex and Chloe slipped away from the grand banquet before midnight. They walked alone through the private royal gardens, guided only by the silver moonlight. The air smelled sweetly of blooming night jasmine and damp earth. Alex removed his heavy ceremonial cloak and draped it over a carved stone bench. He sat down and pulled Chloe gently onto his lap. She curled against his chest, tucking her cold fingers inside the collar of his tunic. He wrapped his strong arms around her, shielding her entirely from the cool evening breeze. "Is the capital finally at peace?" Chloe asked, resting her head against his steady heartbeat. "The war is over," Alex confirmed, resting his chin softly against the top of her head. He looked out over the quiet gardens, a profound sense of closure washing over his tired soul. He had spent decades fighting in the darkness, believing he was destined to die in the snow. "I never thought I would live to see a spring like this," he admitted quietly. Chloe shifted slightly, looking up into his relaxed, handsome face. "You survived because you still had a heart left to give," she told him. Alex smiled, a rare, genuine expression that transformed his harsh features into something entirely beautiful. He tightened his embrace, holding her closer than he ever had before. She barely reached his chest, yet she filled every empty space inside his shattered life. The monster the world feared had finally laid down his weapons for good. He had found his permanent home, not on a cold obsidian throne, but right here, in her arms.
Honestly, my favorite part of this story isn't the magic or the battles. It's the simple truth that even the most feared man in the world just needed a safe place to land. If Alex and Chloe's journey warmed your heart, please subscribe to the channel. I'd love to know where you're listening from today. Drop your city or country in the comments. And tell me,
What kind of hero should we create next? See you soon.